As you know, I am running for president on an independent slate in all 50 states. The important thing here is to have presidential politics pay attention to the necessities of the American people, because presidential politics has been broken for a long time. The two parties have been broken. They need a wake-up call. They need somebody to hold their feet to the fire inside the electoral arena. That's the only language they understand.
Outside of Jerry Falwell, I can't think anybody I have greater contempt for than Ralph Nader. And no one in the history of the world has on a bigger ego trip than Ralph Nader.
One is always right. One is prefabricated in purity. I think this is Ralph Nader's understanding of the world. He can't make mistakes because he's saintly. He's the man on the white horse.
Thank you, Ralph, for the Iraq War. Thank you, Ralph, for the tax cuts. Thank you, Ralph, for the destruction of the environment. Thank you, Ralph, for the destruction of the Constitution.
I find this worse than naive. I think it borders on the wicked.
I just think the man needs to go away. I think he needs to live in a different country. He's done enough damage to this one. Let him damage somebody else's now.
There are some of his major supporters that just...
Ralph, go back to examining the rear end of automobiles and don't risk costing the Democrats a White House this year as you did 4 years ago.
Well, that's the real tragedy. It's going to be the first line of his obit. It's really, there's a Shakespearean feature to this.
It's a responsibility of a serious person.
On the issues that Nader stood for, it wasn't just
a lot of people still be alive if Ralph had been silenced from March to November.
Go back to examining the rear end of automobiles.
Two perish in the cab of burning truck. 2 Wisconsin couples die in car collision in North Dakota. 15 children orphaned. Texas collision takes 5 lives. Crash kills 6 on Chicago highway. And on through the daily newspapers.
Ralph decided that auto safety was of interest to him when some friends of his had been victimized by unsafe cars.
Frederick Condon was a Harvard Law School classmate of mine, and at age 28, with a wife and 4 children, he was driving home from work in New Hampshire one evening, and the car rolled. There were no seat belts in those days. He was half in, half out on the roll, and became a paraplegic.
And on his own, as a freelance journalist, Ralph wrote an article for The Nation magazine in 1959 about the designed-in dangers of automobiles. Totally novel topic at the time.
It's hard to reimagine a world in which your car's not safe. It's not what it should be. In a car-worshipping culture that not only thought the car was everything, but the car was where all your hopes and dreams for a better life were, that car was going to take you to the girl you needed to meet, or it was going to take you off into the world and give you this dream life.
They could sell power and style, you know, a stratospheric V8 or all this kind of stuff, and associating power and style with sex. It was hard to make an issue like safety compete with that.
Injuries are needlessly aggravated by the horn ornaments and sharp edges and extremely intolerant external sheet metal design.
This must be an important announcement because Henry Ford II is addressing the group.
We at Ford Motor Company.
In the 50s, Ford Motor Company put a safety package on the road in 1955-56.
I am most happy, therefore, to announce that all of the Pioneer safety features and the specifications and design...
It had a lap belt, a padded dashboard, a padded sun visor. These were all optional equipment. That safety package was extremely popular. But then General Motors got infuriated and called up Ford and said, called Henry Ford, and they said, if you don't get rid of that package, we're going to undercut you and put you out of business. Henry Ford decided that they would drop the safety package. It wasn't that safety didn't sell. They couldn't supply enough safety belts for this. It was that the program had been cut off by the auto executives.
Behind it all was they didn't want federal regulators telling them how to build a car in terms of safety, and then they said if it's done in safety, it will be done in pollution control, and it will be done in fuel efficiency, and that's an easy sell in Detroit. That would cool off any engineer or business executive who wanted to continue selling psychosexual dreamboats.
I was working at the New Republic magazine, and that was a time, I have to say, when the New Republic magazine was sort of liberal.
I called up, and it just so happened that Jim Ridgway answered.
And he always had like one of these stories about what was going on under the surface. Now, they weren't conspiracy stories, but they were also, but they bordered on it.
He said, I'm very busy, you got 3 minutes. I said, well, I can get it across in 3 minutes.
And his big thing was the car, the Corvair car.
The 1960-63 Corvair, which has some remarkable characteristics. It's one of the few cars I know that can do the bossa nova on dry pavement and the Watusi on wet.
Yip-yow! Corvair! Nothing to it with Corvair's rear engine balance and traction.
Ralph pointed out that with its swing axle rear suspension, and it's a rear engine vehicle, that a lot of times a person in a maneuver on the highway, the vehicle would tend to slide out or oversteer. Going around a curve, for example, it would tend to slide out and it would then trip and roll over. There were people that were being needlessly killed and paralyzed and burned in vehicle crashes.
I read an article in the New Republic by James Ridgway, Corvair tragedy. I felt so upset that the possibility that automobile manufacturers were aware of design flaws that endangered passengers and still manufactured them.
This was not a popular subject, This was before anybody was really interested in this stuff.
I said, Jim, if half of what you wrote is true, it's a national outrage and we must have a book. And Jim said, everything I wrote was true, but I'm not going to write a book for you or anybody else. And he said, besides which, anybody who writes about this subject leans on a guy in Washington, a lawyer named Ralph Nader. He knows more than any other 10 people in the world about the whole area of automobile safety. And he said, but you'll have a tough time finding him. I finally got hold of the secret number of the boarding house on 19th Street, which I can still remember. Adams 41978. I'll never forget it.
He took that isolated accident, which was always blamed on the so-called nut behind the wheel, and said that no, this is something that's preventable. We can design cars more safely. That hadn't occurred to anybody before.
The nut behind the wheel is a myth. What kills you in an auto crash is how the structure of the vehicle behaves. And yet they said the whole thing is how you drive. Not that the steering wheel spears you, not that the roof crushes in on your head. No, it's how you drive that's relevant. It's a myth.
People knew that automobile accidents had been occurring for decades. What they didn't know was that this was a systematic issue.
The engineers knew all along that they were building junk. I'd fly to Detroit Airport and we'd circle the airport in a unlabeled motor vehicle while I was interviewing these whistleblowers who I called hidden patriots. And of course they didn't want their names known because they'd be fired by the auto company that employed them.
Here was someone saying, this vehicle that you think is the essence of your happiness, that the advertising community in Detroit has told you is everything you're ever going to need to be happy, is incredibly, recklessly dangerous.
The issue about marketing that book always was, do people, even if every word in it is true and everything about it is as outrageous as he says, Do people want to read about that?
There was one particularly interested party, and this made all the difference.
Somebody once said to me, is Ralph paranoid? And I said, he's only paranoid because people are following him.
Ralph, being of a somewhat suspicious mind, quickly caught on that there were these coincidences and people accosting him, including a woman in the supermarket.
A young lady came up and said, we're having a discussion on foreign affairs. Would you like to join us? Well, you know, this is rather strange. You know, I mean, it's not like you're at some party or you're at some classroom and someone says that. You're buying cookies, you know, from the cookie counter. I think she was interested in a domestic affair.
The same thing goes on here all the time. The only reason anybody investigates anybody, you know, outside of these congressional hearings, which now don't amount to anything, is to smear people, following them around, usually trying to get them in sexual activity, is to get them down.
He started to get calls at odd hours, 2 or 3 in the morning, and they would have strange covers. They'd say, you know, this is Western Union calling, there's a package for you, that kind of thing. They'd also say threatening things like, you know, watch out, buddy boy.
Mother was getting calls in 3 o'clock in the morning calls saying, tell your son, you know, to shove off. There were threats.
I was walking to the old Senate office building in an underground corridor that they use. One of the Capitol policemen said to me, you better get out here, there are a couple of detectives following you. And I said, what do you mean? 2 guys following me. He said, didn't you write a book on auto safety? I said, no.
It was February of '66, a Saturday afternoon, when Ralph Nader told me he'd been followed the previous day. Well, you can't write a story saying somebody says he's being followed. There's absolutely no evidence of it.
I felt that I better tell somebody in case I wound face down in the Potomac or Anacostia River or something strange was going on. So I told my editor, the national editor of the Washington Post, Larry Stern.
And then Larry Stern, my boss, told me that another Post reporter who has white skin and black hair had told him something very similar.
Because we were so tall, thin, dark hair.
I was, you know, astonished to have this confirmation.
The detective was following people along, making telephone calls and saying he was somebody or other.
He went to Ralph Nader's friends and associates and he pretended that Ralph Nader had been offered a job. People began to wonder why, if he was being offered a job, were they so consumed with, you know, was he smoking pot, was he gay? They put it together, realized, yes, in fact, a person who's testifying before Congress has someone breathing down their neck, trying to figure out what's going on. They call some of the big auto companies. Ford says, it's not us. Chrysler says, it's not us. General Motors issues a statement where they indicate they don't know what's going on, but they don't demur.
I can remember getting a call in the wee hours of the morning from Ralph, and I said, well, what's the matter? And he said, it's GM.
General Motors sends sexy women into a supermarket to seduce him into a compromising position. I mean, I thought this was the damnedest thing I'd ever heard in my life.
After we heard that General Motors had turned the babes loose on him in the grocery, and we thought that was an unwise decision from a public relations standpoint for our greatest corporation.
I mean, General Motors was clearly, you know, pissed off because, you know, they were going to face a lot of suits. I mean, there was a lot of serious stuff here.
When this was confirmed that General Motors was responsible, the Senator Ribicoff from Connecticut, who headed the relevant Senate committee in this area, went ballistic. The president of General Motors was summoned.
You've got television cameras out there, and you've got a packed congressional hearing room. Everything's set up for maximum theater. You've got Bobby Kennedy there, Abraham Ribicoff, and then at a lower elevation, James Roach, CEO of General Motors.
Legal right to ascertain necessary facts preparatory to litigation.
I don't see how you can know and order the investigation and then put out a statement like this, which is not accurate. That, Mr. Roach, disturbs me as much as the fact that you conducted the investigation in the way that it was conducted in the beginning.
It made a huge impact. because it was clear that there was something substantive here.
Let us assume that you found something wrong with his sex life. What would that have to do with whether or not he was right or wrong on the Corvair?
Nothing.
What
Ribikoff had a copy of the book on the table in front of him as he was questioning General Motors, who said, and so you hired detectives to try to get dirt on this young man, to besmirch his character because of statements he made about your unsafe automobiles. And then he grabbed the book and threw it down on the table and said, and you didn't find a damn thing.
I think the thing that has persuaded me to continue and continue in this area is that I don't want to have a climate in this country where one has to have an ascetic existence and steely determinations in order to speak truthfully and candidly and critically of American industry.
I want to apologize here and now to the members of this subcommittee and Mr. Nader. I sincerely hope that these apologies will be accepted.
When the chairman of a big corporation admits something like that and apologizes, boy, that's big news for everybody.
It launched Ralph Nader into instant national prominence.
And it intersects with the auto safety bill. The hearing on Ralph being followed by General Motors was in March of 1966, and the bill's through the Senate in May. It was just amazing.
Will somehow be able to build in more safety without building on more costs.
If you get things out in the open, you'll get some action. There's no place for secrecy anywhere in traffic safety.
It's the record of the press. They don't pay attention to all kinds of serious issues until there's some kind of spark. I've often said I thought that if that GM detective who had tailed him had spotted him in a Safeway with his hand on a girl's fanny, that would have been the end. He wouldn't have, the issue would not have taken off.
Winsted, Connecticut was a town then about 10,000 people. There were lots of mills in town. It was a town that had lots of immigrants, Polish, Italian, people from the Middle East, Arabic, and Yankee. It was quite a mix.
Winsted was governed by a town meeting form of government, which meant that the citizens would convene a town meeting, and they were the legislature. Probably the most pristine form of democracy in the world. We would be taken to these town meetings at a young, impressionable age by my mother and father.
Dad came to this country in 1912. He was self-made in every way. He was in the food business, but I think what he most liked was not so much the business part of it, but he loved talking to people, particularly about politics.
They used to say, when you went into Nader's restaurant, for a nickel, you got a cup of coffee and 10 minutes of political conversation.
And people would sometimes say to him, Mr. Nader, if you continue along that line, you're going to alienate people and they're not going to want to come into your business. And that didn't bother him a bit. He said, when I went past the Statue of Liberty, I took it seriously. So you have the freedom to speak your mind.
Every morning before school started, Ralph's father would announce at the breakfast table a topic that was to be covered at dinner that night.
He would give us problems to answer. It wasn't just a simple question of fact.
They would say, we're going to talk now about the problems of Main Street and the lack of parking. And so we try to figure out how to solve this parking problem.
We had opinions because we had to, because we talked about these things at the dinner tables. You weren't allowed to run, and you certainly weren't allowed to run if you were losing the argument.
One time when I was around 10, I went home from school, went in the backyard, and my father was there, and he said, well, Ralph, what did you learn in school today? Did you learn how to believe, or did you learn how to think?
My mother really was focused on her family. And as we grew and went into the school system, she became a great community activist in all kinds of issues.
Mother Nader at one time, who's alleged to have talked to Senator Prescott Bush, the grandfather of the current president
He came to his constituents to see how things were because we had the big floods, which destroyed in the middle of 55. It just gutted Main Street. So we needed a dry dam.
So she went through the reception line, and as she was shaking hands, she said,
Senator Bush, I want you to promise me that you will go back to Washington and get us a dry dam so this kind of destructive flood never happens again.
And he said, yes, it was very pleasant to see you. He began to move her on.
She would not let go until he promised her.
And there's a dam in the Mad River right outside Winstead. I'll show it to you.
Today, Ralph Nader settled for $425,000 his action against General Motors arising out of harassment by General Motors and invasion of his privacy.
After the congressional testimony and after the apology that Ralph Nader got from James Roach, the CEO of General Motors, he wasn't done with GM yet. So he launched a what was then a landmark invasion of privacy case.
This is by far the largest amount ever paid as damages for invasion of privacy or in any other similar type case.
There was a delicious irony in the fact that General Motors provided the seed money for the career and history that has become Ralph Nader.
In other words, this is not the end of the crusade of Ralph Nader against General Motors and other corporations that he feels are acting in the same manner.
The misuse of law as an instrument of oppression is not new.
The annual increase of oil and gas prices.
Fantastic swindling in the marketplace, knowingly. 1 million pounds of meat a day is unfit for human consumption. The U.S. Department of Agriculture, corporate crime, and the National Air Pollution Control Administration.
You are committing a
Without
fraud
facts
in
and
American
without
public.
proof, do you want me to read you the 18 volumes before this committee and the Senate Antitrust Committee? What do you call them? Do you want me to reproduce them all? The facts are overwhelming.
I saw Ralph Nader in a suit of armor on the cover of Newsweek magazine. It was '68, and that's what gave Bob Fellmuth the idea of contacting him. I had never written or spoken to anyone I considered as important as Ralph at that point. And I don't mean famous, I mean important. So we said, all right, well, we'll write a letter.
I wrote him a letter and I said, I want to join you in your judicious jihad, which I thought was very clever at the time. I didn't really know that he was from the Christian area of Lebanon, and the only people interested in jihad probably wanted to do his family in.
5 days later, around midnight, Ralph calls, and we had a long conversation. I was trying to convince him, hey, there's this enormous pool of student power. You ought to try to tap into that. He was very, very close to the vest. Oh, he asked me one other thing. He wanted to know if I played chess or poker.
He said, come down to Washington and meet us. And we walk into O'Donnell's fish restaurant, and he looks around and looks at us, spots us. I guess we must have stood out, these two twerps in suits. And he says, Fellmuth, Eggendorf, yes, yes. Nods curtly, sits down, looks at us. No greeting like, how was your trip? None of that. Just, there's an agency that's been pulling the wool over the eyes of the people of this town for a long time. You know, of course, which one I'm talking about. And, of course, I'm the smart alecky guy, so I said, of course, you're talking about the Interstate Commerce Commission. No. The Securities and Exchange Commission. No. The Federal Power Commission. No. The Atomic Energy Commission. No. I'm running out of alphabet soup. So I finally said, okay, I give up. He said, the Federal Trade Commission. And I said, well, that's interesting. They have a pretty good reputation. And he said, precisely my point.
It's a shame that you should ever feel tired because of iron-poor blood. What can you do when iron-poor tired blood makes you feel run down? You can take Geritol.
This is the point where Ralph wanted me to look into the Geritol situation, because the FTC really didn't go after major players, only little players. And I said, well, what's the goal here? What are we really trying to do? And he said, well, at a minimum, to revive the FTC. But as for you, to demonstrate the student power you told me about. Once he decided to use students, Bob and I were chosen to start it.
He had 7 people lined up to investigate the FTC. You could call them, I guess, radical nerds. They didn't believe in the way the system was being operated, but they believed in the values of the system.
Radical nerds is pretty good, although the radicals would have said nerds, not radical nerds.
Instead of wanting to tear down the system, we said, that 9th grade That ninth grade civics model, that was a pretty good model. I think I want to see it in place. We were naturally attracted to Nader because he was kind of doing that. It was kind of a different kind of thing for people to do during that era, because this was the 60s. People who were young were convinced that the older people had screwed things up pretty badly.
Our movement benefited enormously from the hundreds of thousands of people who are fighting the Vietnam War and fighting for civil rights and who are in the streets. It created the climate, the atmosphere that made our efforts appear less extreme.
Members of the press have referred to you as Nader's Raiders.
I was a brand new reporter at the Post, and they sent me to the Federal Trade Commission, where these 5 or 6 young college guys were raking the Federal Trade Commission, which was this icon of regulatory power.
So Grider wrote an article, and he just called us Nader's Raiders, and that was the term that stuck.
It was just a catchy phrase that expressed it very neatly. Ralph, for years, would scold me. You'd miss the whole idea of individual citizens. You're trying to make it into a celebrity game when you're making me into an icon. That's not what this is about, and so forth and so on.
Mr. Nader has shown students who say that it's impossible to change things through the system, that in fact it is possible to effect change from within.
We bought Ralph's idea. We were going to make the country what it ought to be by working and pressing the system to work.
I just put a little note up in various schools and said, if you're interested, send me your resume and your interest. And I got maybe 400 or 500 responses, just based on a note written, put on a bulletin board somewhere. And it was that summer that all of these 110 people lined up the steps of the Capitol. And the title of the picture is "The Lone Ranger Gets a Posse."
Ralph had decided to do about 6 or 8 teams attacking different agencies. There was a team on the Food and Drug Administration, one on water pollution, one on air pollution.
These groups all came out and they eventually published books. The FDA report became The Chemical Feast. The air pollution became Vanishing Air. The report on water pollution became Water Wasteland. Those were the Nader's Raiders doing that work with Ralph orchestrating it from a distance. He was the kind of person who said, you're in charge of this, here's the mission, do it, and then he'd review the final product and give you a sign-off at the end. But he respected you.
And the quality of the reports that came out was on the whole pretty high. There was never one of the Nader reports of that summer or any summer since then that was exposed as a fraud.
In the late 60s and early 70s, Ralph would be in national polls as one of the most famous admired Americans, up there with Walter Cronkite, what have you. And so people threw around his name for president, and he would always laugh it off.
Stuff they don't
Would you
want,
ever consider running for president?
No.
Why? Are you sincere?
There's a good reason. I think that the political system, the country today, is so encrusted with bureaucracy and special interests and waste and inefficiency that what you have to do is step back and start by trying to help organize people and trying to get them to see citizenship as a profession. And then, out of this kind of grassroots effort will come better candidates.
In 1972, of course, Eagleton was on and then off the ticket.
The phone rings at Nader headquarters, and this 21-year-old guy, fresh out of college, picks up the phone. It's George McGovern, and he's in shock. Can't believe it. A candidate for President of the United States is there on the line.
He called up a number of people, including myself, to ask if we were willing to be considered for vice presidential candidacy on his ticket.
Because at that point, they needed something, we call it a Hail Mary pass, something just to shake up what was a bad situation.
And I said, I appreciate very much, thank you very much for calling me about this, but I'd prefer to remain as a full-time citizen.
A huge political change in Ralph's fortunes came when Jimmy Carter was elected.
Well, I'm glad that Mr. Nader's come down. We had a brief conversation before the convention and decided then that after the convention was over that he would come down and spend the night to discuss some of the problems that consist among consumers and that might be of importance to the American people.
Mr. Nader, what are the principal things you would like to see a Carter administration do that would aid consumers?
I think basically to enforce the laws affecting consumers, which have been around.
Ralph Nader basically thought that that Camelot days had arrived.
The next 4 years, I think, will provide a spectacular potential for a confrontation between the Congress and the executive branch as to how the power is going to be distributed within our government and to whom it is going to be accountable.
Here he had someone who was sympathetic to his point of view, a Democrat in office, and Nader thought he was going to be willing to enact the types of things that Nader wanted to see enacted.
The point is that the Carter administration afforded opportunities that hadn't been present, at least during this consumer movement of the late 20th century, for people to go into government and try and make a difference.
Many Nader allies became appointees in the new Carter administration. Perhaps the most prominent among them was Joan Claybrook.
Carter had been very favorable to hire women in high positions. I was asked to head the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration, and so I went to Ralph and said that I'd been asked to take this job. Ralph does not like people to leave his organization. He gets very angry at them when they leave. I said that I thought that this was important for the cause, and he had to admit that it was.
I told all the people who worked with us and who went into the Carter administration that they were carrying the reputation of consumer protection into their jobs, and that if they didn't uphold that reputation, I was going to criticize them publicly.
This created some new tensions between Ralph, the outside campaigner, and his allies now on the inside, who had a more complex set of political issues to negotiate.
The first decision to be made on auto safety was on airbags. It hadn't happened in the Ford administration, and so it was now on the table for the Carter administration. And there was a law that was passed in 1974 that said that the Congress could veto this decision. For me, the issue was to get this not vetoed by the Congress. So I felt that if we gave them a little bit more lead time, that would make it possible for us to be successful. And then Ralph got mad.
First of all, it was a 3 or 4 year delay before the first category of cars could get the airbag. And I knew that the auto industry, given that period of time, would strike back and try to scuttle or get the regulation revoked.
And so he wrote one letter and no one paying attention to it. So then he wrote a meaner letter and it got on the front page of the Washington Post.
It was a tough letter. But on the other hand, this was the biggest auto safety standard in modern history, and I saw it going down the drain. It was not just some little spat. It broke the back of the regulatory auto safety movement for more than a few years.
This was the ultimate clash between high-minded idealism and personal loyalty.
I had a press conference in my own inner office with only about 4 or 5 reporters. And he knocked over a secretary or two, and not literally, but if you know what I mean, verbally, and walked in and sat down, and we had the fight right there.
I came up to her, and in front of the press, crowding around her, I said, "Surely you don't believe in this decision, do you?" And she says, "Absolutely, I believe in it." To me, that set the stage for the criticism.
It's okay. I mean, I'm tough. I can have a fight with him. It was just, I'd rather have a discussion with him rather than a public dispute, but that's the way he framed it, so that's the way it was.
Well, to me, my compass was the people on the highway. I was working, in effect, as a trustee for people on the highway. And so things like associates, friendships, sentiment are secondary to pushing life-saving standards into law.
Some people said that he shouldn't have, been so harsh on someone he knew had the best intentions, but, that's Ralph's way.
Personal loyalty cannot come at any price. It becomes an indulgence. And you ask yourself, personal loyalty for what? Well, for marching shoulder to shoulder to an accomplished objective. But if that no longer is the case, then what's the function of personal loyalty? It's unadulterated, mawkish sentiment while people are dying needlessly on the highway.
We didn't talk for about a year, maybe 2, but we got over it.
A recurrent theme in Ralph's advocacy has been concern for the integrity of the body. Many of Ralph's policy initiatives have tried to develop new legal doctrines, new regulatory schemes to protect the body from assault and harm.
One nuclear power plant catastrophe would be 45,000 dead, well over 100,000 seriously injured, untold damage to future generations.
For about a decade, Ralph had the field almost to himself. He had built a legislative record as a private citizen that would have been the envy of any modern president. That included the Clean Air Act, Mining Health and Safety Act, the Freedom of Information Act, Occupational Safety and Health Act. Ralph also provided the leadership and seed money to start numerous consumer organizations. Congress Watch, the Health Research Group, the Critical Mass Energy Project, the Tax Reform Research Group, the Litigation Group. All of these were eventually joined together as Public Citizen.
The workers today are being manipulated by companies and by government in a far
Corporate America was flummoxed. They were just getting skewered right and left and didn't know how to respond. But by the mid to late 70s, they started to mobilize their own response. And the showdown came in 1978 when Ralph wanted to enact a Consumer Protection Agency law, which became the drop-dead epic battle in Congress.
It meant whether people were going to live or die or get sick or get injured or be ripped off in their family budget by, banks and insurance companies and home mortgage companies and all the rest of the unsafe products that were at large in the marketplace.
The idea was one office of advocates who would argue on behalf of consumers in all the other federal agencies.
It was going to be kind of like an ombudsman. It wasn't going to be a regulatory body. It was going to represent citizens aggrieved by various consumer abuses.
And this was an idea that had been on the table since the early 70s, had passed one house one time, another house another time, but for 6 years hadn't ever become law. Now Carter's president, Nader had a good relationship with him. It's time to pass the Consumer Protection Agency.
I do know that he's taken the positions as president thus far that he has promised to take as candidate. He has come out for the Consumer Advocacy Bill.
The Consumer Protection Agency bill was a big one we were fighting before. I think I went in with Reagan. It was a bureaucracy. It was going to have enormous powers. And we fought that very, very hard because we were very anti-big government. And that's what we saw it as.
But it really was the first time they'd been as organized locally. They do that on all kinds of issues now. But it was kind of their test run. This became their number one ask, vote against the consumer bill. We tried to be creative. Let's do something different. And said, how much would it cost to set up this Consumer Protection Agency? It would cost, the guesstimate was $15 million. That worked out to, at the time, a nickel per person.
We got 40,000 people to send nickels to the members of Congress.
To say, I support the Consumer Protection Agency, here's my 5 cents.
So there was the joke that it was a bribe, and with all due respect to members of Congress, they can't be bought for a nickel.
Those nickels attached to postcards was the biggest grassroots effort the consumer movement ever had.
Passed the Senate, failed in the House, and then was never enacted.
I think it was 227 to 189, a vote I won't ever forget.
It didn't help that Jimmy Carter didn't go to bat for the issue either.
At the critical moment when we needed his lobbying help in the House of Representatives, he did not expend the political capital.
It failed because it was caught up in what we now know as the beginnings of the Reagan Revolution. The Reagan-like rhetoric against it scared swing congressmen who made the difference. The argument that this was more big government was rhetorical, shallow, and persuasive.
It wasn't easy to get over it initially.
And I think it left Ralph fairly disillusioned.
Many people say that that was the high watermark of his influence, and from then on, his influence receded because he was not able to push through in 1978 the Consumer Protection Agency Act.
DuPont Circle was the center of all the public interest groups. That's where the Health Research Group and Public Citizen and like Greenpeace and, Citizens for the Environment, every public interest group, because it was cheap to live around there for people like me at the time.
Nader's offices were always the building that was about to be demolished to put up a spanking clean luxury building.
This is the room. It was cheap office space because you weren't that close to the hill.
A lot of this is actually Ralph's stuff and books. We have books everywhere.
We had pillars in the office, pillars made of boxes of books and remaindered books and books that Ralph thought were important and may, be pulped at some point. He didn't want them to disappear.
His office is in there, but it's sort of sprawled out into here because he just has so much stuff. And
it's just this total mess. It's just like some sort of like very, 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 very fucked up library.
He swears it's organized chaos and he knows where everything is, but sometimes it's hard for me to tell if he's in there or not because the papers are stacked so high. Any of the staff are allowed to go in there, but we usually don't have camera crews only because of the state that it's in.
Stacks of mail. Ralph got more mail than anybody I've ever seen in my life. I mean, I think Ralph got more mail than the Beatles. People would write to him thinking that he could solve their problems.
People would call in and ask him to do everything for them, fix my hospital bill, help me with this. People who were desperate. One day, this package comes in, it's like the size of a tree. We're all sitting there. It's like, what is this? And it's a drive shaft from a car. And this woman had sent it in saying, I went to the dealership, I went to all these places that said they could help me fix it, and no one would help me fix it. You have to help me. Please, Ralph Nader, help me.
One day the FedEx man came and he had a box with a lot of dry ice in it. And I thought, what is this? And I opened it up. A guy had sent his lung to Ralph because he was upset that they had taken out his lung and he didn't know if it was really cancerous.
Which basically showed how much trust Ralph had in the public's mind.
There was an image of a Nader's Raider coming out of the late 60s, early 70s, and they're just these, smart, sharp people, totally into whatever the issue they're working on, and just grinding the midnight oil, writing the book, writing the brief, writing the report, all work and no fun. But it's also a very collegial set of people who shared the same values, shared the same commitments, we're working on many of the same goals and even some of the same specific projects.
It pays in psychological rewards.
So he created an environment where you could do exactly what you felt was right. Think about that. How many Americans today can say that they work in a job where every day they go to work and do exactly what they think was right?
There's a satisfaction that if you don't do it, it won't get done.
What Nader told me when I first interviewed with him, you can bring your conscience to work every day.
Everybody worked until 2 in the morning or so, and then we just collapsed and would get up at 8 and start working again.
I mean, we were there, 24/7. It was just ridiculous.
He would always work harder and ask more of himself than he would ask of anybody else, so he led by the force of his example.
Do you install those values in your children, and how do you go about doing that?
Well, I don't have any children. I'm married to General Motors.
People always used to say, why didn't you get married? And he would say, well, what wife would want to tolerate this? And my working, 18 hours a day.
It's really a tough choice. I mean, if you're going to raise children, you should be there.
He gave me a line I'll never forget. It's like, Gene, there are 2 kinds of people in this world, the hardcore and the spouse core. You got to decide, what side are you on?
So he knew enough that if you're going to be that kind of a workaholic, as we call it, then maybe there are other things you can't participate in.
Today, I think he probably regrets he said that. I know he regrets I keep repeating it, but those are his exact words back then.
He was like a priest or a monk because he didn't really have a life like most of us do.
The hardcore and the spouse core. Which side are you on?
No one knows anything about Ralph's personal life, okay?
I dug and dug and dug, hoping to find something. I mean, the very fact that the man has been associated romantically really with just about nobody.
Ralph's personal life is his job.
And as I got further into it, I began to think of it as the anti-sex scandal.
I hope Ralph does have a girlfriend hidden away somewhere. But I don't think he does, okay.
People always think of Ralph as this dour, gloomy person who's always coming in with these horror stories.
This comes, I'm sure, as a surprise to many people who know his public persona. He's very, very funny. He actually has a great sense of humor.
And you don't see that in his public persona, and that's unfortunate, because that's part of his charm, and that's part of the reason some of us who worked for him still have such great affection for him after all these years.
Ralph was preparing to testify about the hidden menace of America's hot dog supply, how these had some kind of additive in them that was destroying the nation's well-being. And so we spent about a half an hour thinking about the slogan that would make it into the evening news. Was it the America's most dangerous unguided missile, America's most dangerous guided missile?
I do not feel the same concern that Mr. Nader expressed about hot dogs. I certainly would not call them missiles of death as he did.
Well, I had forgotten it was missile of death. So those were the days.
Whenever Ralph would come back from the Hill, everybody would flock into the room because you knew that Ralph was going to recreate the hearing and what somebody said. He used to love to do Nixon. He would get the scowl and the glower and the jowls and so forth, and he would do things like, "I am not a crook."
One of the most interesting weeks I've spent was being a sidekick to Ralph as he moved around Saturday Night Live.
The Saturday Night Live footage is fascinating to watch because you will rarely see a person as ill at ease as Ralph Nader is, one, being on television, two, being in a comedy show.
He's a terrible actor because he's authentic. And he did great because it was Ralph Nader wearing an airbag that was supposed to explode.
Not too tight now. Activate my airbag.
But it didn't.
Whoops. Well, live from New York, it's Saturday night.
I was kind of disturbed by the first. It was like not dignified enough.
Bert, I'd like to introduce you to Pam, and I'd like to introduce you to Rita. Rita has been naughty this afternoon, so she has to sit backward. Would you like it?
I loved 1 week later, in 1977, the story that someone saw him on the street and said to him, "I know you. You're the comedian."
Whatever doubts I might have had about it were erased in the next month because people said to me, you know, my kid brother didn't know anything about Nader until he saw him on Saturday Night Live.
Governor Reagan, we just wanted to show you what the map of the United States looks like as of 8 o'clock tonight.
Hey!
It's all yours.
When that began to slide, I thought that maybe the world was going out just as I was getting in.
The Reagan years were a particularly grim time for Nader and his groups.
The Reagan administration has announced a review of 30 additional government regulations to see if they are...
The administration's hit list of regulations include many protecting equal rights, prompting Ralph Nader to say...
In the last few months, it's been quite clear that the Reagan administration wants to, every way it can, remove the application of law and order to the operations of business.
These people knew how to play politics. They knew how to play hardball.
To be in Washington in the early years of the Reagan presidency with Ralph Nader and watching him react to the effort to kind of systematically undo what he had spent 20 years building.
It is time to reawaken this industrial giant, to get government back within its means, and to lighten our punitive tax burden. And these will be our first priorities, and on these principles there will be no compromise.
It's almost like a bad dream where Reagan would appoint to run these agencies, not just people who were from the industries that were being regulated, but people who had devoted their entire careers to tearing down and trying to destroy the very agencies they were now being charged to run.
The Nader people bravely tried to document what was going on, but the electoral power and the persuasive ability of Reagan was just too great.
There was a really fascinating memorandum written by Justice Powell when he was the general counsel of the Chamber of Commerce. And he said there's a threat to America. These public interest groups are a huge threat to America, and every corporation has to react.
At the time he wrote what's now known as the Powell Memo, he was an attorney. Of course, he did go on to become a Supreme Court justice. This was not an obscure figure. This was a call to action by a leading corporate lawyer trying to rally the troops, saying, we're in trouble here. We got to do something very different.
And we have to take back the minds and the hearts of the students and the academics and the media, and we've got to fight them tooth and nail.
And that did spur the business community to reevaluate their role in politics and what they were doing.
Corporate America was investing considerable resources in propaganda efforts, in think tanks that would develop bogus disciplines like cost-benefit and risk management analysis to try to change the whole terms of debate.
And it has completely transformed the way politics take place in D.C. and across the country.
The Heritage Foundation is a free market think tank. We do research and educational efforts on the benefits of limited government, individual responsibility, strong national defense. We like to portray ourselves as having been Ronald Reagan's favorite think tank.
Ralph approached health and safety regulation as an ethical and social issue. Corporate America redefined it as an economic issue.
Corporations don't have that much power in Washington. They tend to be ineffective, especially on the big picture issues. They might be able to get a little special loophole in some bill or a special handout in another bill, but especially in a globalized economy where you have foreign companies penetrating the U.S. market, U.S. companies are probably about the most helpless entities out there.
These corporate think tanks go through their daily life thinking that their glass is only 97% full.
The 80s was a period in which the alliance between the Democrats and the public interest movement started to fray. Too often Democrats would not go to the bat in the same courageous ways to protect the victories of the 60s and 70s. Ralph had relied upon a New Deal and Great Society coalition. That coalition started to fall apart.
The whole thing that we were trying to do was the Great New Deal coalition is to drive these wedges into that coalition, split it off, and take parts of it for the Republican base. And you did this with social, cultural issues. You carve off all their issues which do not conflict with your own and which comport with your own social, cultural beliefs, and keep hammering and hammering and hammering them. And the strategy was called in those days the Northern Catholic Southern Protestant strategy.
And so without the protective cover of that electoral base, Nader's political initiatives were far more vulnerable.
The Reagan era basically forced him to recreate himself. He realized people in Washington weren't going to listen, so he would go straight to the people.
Consumer activist Ralph Nader has been campaigning.
Recreate himself as a grassroots activist.
It was the beginning of the change from the inside the Beltway Ralph to Ralph the out there in the whole country, touching people's lives every day. For a long time, they had just been writing theories out of Washington and things that people should do, but they weren't out there where the real action was. He said that I was his Paul Revere, that he would just throw me into the community not knowing anybody, and I would have to find out how to work on an issue, and then I'd call for reinforcements back in Washington. His first idea, which was wacky, was to have me parachute into towns and say, the Nader Raiders are here to help.
Well, I had this fantasy that wasn't totally whimsical, that we would have a crew of 5 civic paratroopers, and they would parachute into the town. The problem was you could never get them insured, and how could we be assured of the quality of the parachutes if the vendor knew what they were being used for?
But it got crazy because he would literally just leave me in any community. Once I got everybody going forward on an issue, Ralph would come in and give a speech to really empower them more and say, you guys aren't alone here.
when the community of Poletown in Detroit was going to be condemned so that General Motors could build a new Cadillac plant there, Ralph provided direct assistance for them to physically resist the bulldozers.
60,000 people here. In Van Nuys, there were a lot of children coming down with leukemia in a neighborhood, and a General Motors plant was there, and they put benzene in the paint, which was causing cancer and leukemia. We got them to change the way that they manufactured the paint.
Californians love their cars but hate their auto insurance rates.
In the mid-'80s, we had a huge insurance crisis all over the country. The insurance industry sponsored proposals here in California to limit people's right to go to court. People didn't know who to believe or what to believe, but everybody knew that Ralph Nader would never betray them.
The insurance companies are financial, sacred cash cows feeding the public a lot of not-so-sacred bull.
So they voted yes on Prop 103.
And this is the victory for the little guy, for us.
And of course, Proposition 103 delivered $1.2 billion in rate refunds and $23 billion in savings in the first 10 years, just on auto insurance premiums alone.
The second you would say, I'm a Nader's raider, all of a sudden there was an instant credibility where people were like, I so much admire that man, I admire what he's done for this country.
Well, in 1984, we were still of the persuasion that the Democrats are not as bad as the Republicans, so you got to try to get them into office. So we had a very, very competent staff of about a dozen people, and they went around the country in key states to show the difference between Mondale's policies and the Democratic Party's programs and the Republicans and Reagan.
We utilized a good old bus that I designed, the difference in '84. And this bus had all the issues listed on its side that we were trying to ask people to ask their legislators and their candidates about.
And try to keep those Democrats that were moving forward towards the nomination accountable to the citizens out there and the issues that we cared about.
But the national press ignored it because, after all, we weren't inside the electoral arena. We were on the outside.
I remember the diminutive pin we had for the difference in '84. Look at this. This is the difference in '84. You can barely see it, okay? Maybe this could sum it up, but that's the original pin.
Obviously, there were many Democrats that simply wanted to be like Ronald Reagan. He had the winning formula.
That was basically the precursor of about 20 years from 1980 to 2000, where we tried every way to get the Democrats to pick up on issues that really commanded the felt concern and daily life of millions of Americans, but were issues that corporations didn't want attention paid to it. And so, when people say, why'd you do this in 2000 and so on, I'm saying, I'm a 20-year veteran of pursuing the folly of the least worst between the two parties. Because when you do that, you end up allowing them to both get worse every 4 years.
The first time he ran for president was this write-in campaign in the New Hampshire primaries in 1992.
I am none of the above, and I'm not running for president. This is initially confusing.
He was the person who, if you're just simply saying, I'm unhappy with who the Democrats have presented, I'm unhappy with the Democratic field,